The CEO demanded to see the real architect, mocking the presentation, until the janitor everyone ignored stepped forward and revealed the truth that left the entire boardroom in shock. "Stop wasting my time. Bring me the real architect." The words sliced through the air like broken glass, leaving an aftertaste of arrogance that clung to the walls of the boardroom. Gregory Harlow, CEO of Harlow Development, sat with his legs crossed and his hands clasped loosely across his lap. He didn't raise his voice, but the contempt in it was enough to make the junior project manager shrink into silence. A dozen faces around the long oak table turned toward him, some with discomfort, others with the blank expression of people who'd seen him humiliate staff before. The lights overhead gleamed against polished mahogany, steel water pitchers, and untouched coffee cups. The room smelled faintly of leather and disinfectant, the kind of sterility only expensive offices could maintain. The young manager tried to find his words again, stumbling, "Sir, this is the presentation." Gregory leaned back further, a small dismissive laugh leaving his lips. "Don't insult me. You didn't design this. Someone smarter did. Where is he? Bring me the person whose brain actually made this happen." The silence grew heavier. Papers shuffled nervously. Investors from Boston and Dallas, flown in for the review of a housing project meant to reshape parts of Charlotte's struggling neighborhoods, shifted in their seats. Some glanced toward the glass walls that revealed the skyline outside, as if the city itself might rescue them from the discomfort. Then, from the far corner of the room, a faint sound broke through, the quiet clank of a mop bucket. No one paid him much attention when he entered earlier. He had been there every morning for as long as most of them could remember. The man who vacuumed the carpets before meetings began. The man who emptied bins full of half-finished reports and food wrappers after executives left. Always silent. Always invisible. But now, Samuel Okoye stood up straight. He removed the gloves from his hands, folding them neatly on the lid of the bucket. His work shirt was faded, the navy cotton stretched across shoulders that carried years of labor. His dark eyes, steady and unhurried, moved toward the table stacked with diagrams and blueprints. And then, with the calm of someone who had been waiting for this moment, not for weeks, but for a lifetime, he stepped forward. "Mr. Harlow," Samuel said, his voice low but clear, "I designed this project." The room snapped awake. Every chair creaked. Every pair of eyes locked on him. A janitor, claiming ownership of the very project that had investors writing checks with 7 zeros. Gregory's lips curled into a smirk. "You?" He let the word drag out, coated with disbelief. "You sweep floors, Mr. What did you say your name was?" "Okoye. Samuel Okoye," he replied. He didn't flinch, didn't lower his voice. He walked closer to the table and rested a finger on the stack of drawings. "And yes, I sweep floors, but I also spent 2 years designing every line of what you see in front of you." One of the investors, a woman in her 60s wearing a sharp navy suit, leaned forward. "Wait, are you saying you're the architect of this?" Samuel nodded once. "The blueprint is mine. The concept of mixed-income housing, the rooftop solar grids, the stormwater systems designed for flood prevention, it's my work." He turned his gaze back to Gregory. "And if you'll allow me, I can explain why it matters." The CEO laughed again, but the sound rang hollow this time. "This is ridiculous. Do you expect us to believe that my firm has been employing some kind of janitor genius?" Samuel's reply was steady. "I don't expect you to believe. I expect you to listen." A murmur passed through the room. People whispered behind hands. Someone coughed just to cut through the tension. And yet, Samuel pressed on. He unrolled one of the large diagrams and held it flat against the table. His finger traced a line along the structure of the housing units. "Here, you'll see where I integrated rainwater collection. Charlotte had record flooding 3 years ago. This design prevents families from losing their homes again." Another finger moved across the page. "This section provides affordable housing units alongside market-rate condos. If you ignore that balance, you'll force families out of their neighborhoods. But keep it, and you'll stabilize communities instead of tearing them apart." The more he spoke, the quieter the room became. Even the investors, who had seemed skeptical, leaned closer, drawn not by authority, but by conviction. Gregory sat frozen, the color draining slightly from his face. For years, he had built his reputation on commanding a room. But in this moment, it wasn't his voice that carried weight. It was the voice of the man no one had thought to notice. But what Samuel revealed next would turn quiet disbelief into raw tension that threatened to split the room in two. The silence that lingered after Samuel's words wasn't just surprise, it was confusion. The janitor had spoken with authority, yet most of the executives in the room had no idea who he really was. To them, Samuel had always been part of the background, as ordinary as the coffee machine or the faint smell of polish on the conference table. But to understand how he had ended up here, you have to know where Samuel came from. Samuel Okoye was born in Newark, New Jersey, to parents who had immigrated from Nigeria. His father worked long shifts at the port, while his mother kept 3 jobs, cleaning houses, cooking at a diner, and caring for elderly neighbors to make sure their children stayed in school. From a young age, Samuel's love of drawing was more than a hobby. He didn't sketch cars or comic heroes the way other kids did. He drew buildings, streets, bridges, whole neighborhoods. By the time he was in high school, his teachers noticed his talent. One geometry teacher, Mrs. Benton, once told him after class, "Samuel, you don't just solve problems. You see them before they exist. That's what makes an architect." He never forgot her words. He worked his way through Rutgers University, studying architecture, often balancing late-night shifts at a grocery store to pay tuition. For a while, everything seemed to be lining up. Internships, scholarships, a career path. Then came 2008. The housing crash didn't just wipe out Wall Street portfolios. It gutted opportunities for young architects. Firms shut their doors. Promises of jobs disappeared overnight. Samuel, fresh out of school with a degree but without connections, found himself applying for work anywhere that would have him. At first, he thought the janitorial job at Harlow Development would be temporary, just a stopgap until he got licensed and found an opening. But months became years. The work was steady, the paycheck reliable, and his pride didn't allow him to sit at home doing nothing. He swept floors, emptied trash, replaced light bulbs in the same office where developers and designers laid out blueprints he knew he could have created. Yet Samuel never stopped sketching. He bought graph paper with his own money and carried notebooks filled with designs. He stayed late in the office some nights, quietly studying the plans others left behind, refining them in his mind. On weekends, while other workers rested, he spent hours researching new sustainable materials, reading about green energy solutions, and keeping his knowledge sharp. He didn't flaunt it, but he didn't hide it either. A few staffers had noticed. The receptionist once saw him scribbling lines that looked too precise for doodles. One of the accountants glimpsed his binder stuffed with design drafts, but no one asked. After all, he was just the janitor. Still, Samuel kept pushing. He believed opportunity had a way of revealing itself, but only if you were ready when the moment came. That moment arrived 6 months before the boardroom scene. Late one evening, when the office was nearly empty, he found a set of preliminary plans left behind by a junior designer. They were sloppy, riddled with mistakes that could have cost millions if they reached investors. Samuel sat down at an empty desk and, without realizing the time, worked through the night redrawing them. When the junior designer came back the next morning, expecting a disaster, he found Samuel's corrected version instead. At first, he panicked, thinking he'd be accused of incompetence, but then he presented the drawings at the next review. To his shock, the executives praised the revisions. They assumed he'd done the work himself. Samuel said nothing. He didn't want the credit stolen, but he wasn't interested in throwing anyone under the bus either. Quietly, he let the man take the applause. But word began to spread. Those corrections kept appearing in project drafts. Mistakes were fixed before deadlines, and innovations slipped into designs. No one could explain how, but it kept happening. One afternoon, an intern spotted Samuel scribbling over a copy of blueprints in the break room. When the intern asked what he was doing, Samuel simply said, "Making sure families don't get left behind in this project." The intern laughed, assuming it was a joke, but it wasn't. Behind the mop bucket and gloves, Samuel carried the weight of an architect's mind and a community builder's heart. And even though he worked in silence, his fingerprints were already on the company's future. But when Gregory demanded the real architect that morning, Samuel realized silence was no longer enough. It was time to step out of the shadows. The conference room was still thick with disbelief when Samuel finished tracing the rainwater system on the blueprint. His calm delivery had steadied the nerves of some investors, but Gregory Harlow's pride couldn't tolerate what was happening. The man who had spent years building his reputation on dominance and swagger was now being upstaged by someone he had dismissed without a second thought. Gregory leaned forward, his elbows on the table, eyes narrowing. Mr. Okoye, do you realize what you're doing right now? You're standing in front of multi-million-dollar investors claiming ownership of a project designed by my firm. That's not only ridiculous, it's insulting. Samuel kept his tone even. With respect, Mr. Harlow, I'm not claiming anything. I'm explaining what I created. Gasps whispered through the room. The investors exchanged sharp glances. Some scribbled notes while others leaned back in their chairs, intrigued by the boldness in Samuel's words. One of the younger executives, a man named Connor Briggs, tried to cut the tension. Maybe we should verify the facts. Surely there's documentation of who submitted the original design drafts. Gregory shot him a glare sharp enough to end the thought. Don't undermine me, Connor. This man is a janitor. He doesn't have the credentials, the licensing, or the authority to even call himself an architect. Samuel's jaw tightened, but he didn't raise his voice. You're right. I don't have the license. I couldn't afford to complete the process after the crash. But knowledge doesn't vanish because paperwork is missing. Every line on these plans reflects training, research, and vision. All mine. For the first time, his voice carried an edge, not anger, but conviction. An investor named Harold Kinney, a retired real estate developer from Phoenix, leaned forward, tapping his pen against the table. Gregory, I've been in this business for 50 years. I've seen a lot of bluffers, a lot of talkers. That man doesn't sound like either. He knows the details. Cold, Gregory's smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly. With all due respect, Harold, you've been around long enough to know confidence can be faked. He's probably read enough scraps lying around the office to sound convincing. That doesn't make him the architect of this project. The woman in the navy suit, her name was Sylvia Torres, spoke up next. Then let's test him. If he's bluffing, it'll fall apart. All eyes turned back to Samuel. Gregory sat back, arms crossed, a cruel smile creeping across his lips. Fine. Let's hear your explanation for the load-bearing design on Building C. The drafts were a nightmare. Go ahead, enlighten us. Samuel didn't hesitate. He reached for the corresponding sheet, spread it flat, and pointed. The initial design failed to account for soil displacement in this area. Charlotte's southeast side has clay-heavy soil prone to expansion and contraction. That would eventually crack foundations and destabilize support beams, so I redesigned the base with reinforced concrete and incorporated tension cables to distribute weight more evenly. It costs more upfront, but prevents catastrophic failure later. The room was silent again, but this time for a different reason. Sylvia tapped the paper with her manicured finger. That's exactly the kind of issue most firms miss. And your solution matches what third-party consultants have been recommending for months. How did you know that? Samuel straightened. Because I lived through it. My cousin lost his home to structural failure on similar soil after heavy rains. I studied everything I could find to make sure it never happened again in any design I touched. The silence carried weight, the kind that couldn't be brushed aside with Gregory's theatrics. Gregory's face flushed. So what? You expect me to hand over credit to someone who doesn't even belong at this table? This is my company, my reputation. Samuel finally looked him square in the eyes. His tone was calm, but firm. With all due respect, Mr. Harlow, reputations built on ignoring truth don't last, but buildings designed with care do. You asked for the real architect. You have him. The tension broke like glass. Two investors whispered to each other with raised eyebrows. Connor Briggs, still nervous, glanced at Gregory before murmuring, "He makes a strong case, sir." Gregory slammed his palm on the table. "Enough!" His voice cracked with the effort, echoing against the glass walls. "This meeting is about my project, not a janitor's delusions." But the more he pushed, the more the room leaned towards Samuel. His quiet authority was proving stronger than Gregory's bluster, but the investors weren't done. They wanted answers, and their questions would push the clash even further. The investors leaned back in their chairs, the weight of the moment, pulling their eyes from Samuel to Gregory and back again. Everyone in that room felt the balance shifting. The only one who seemed unwilling to admit it was Gregory himself. From the far end of the table, Sylvia Torres adjusted her glasses and spoke carefully. "Gregory, if Mr. Okoye is lying, this will become obvious in minutes. But if he's telling the truth, then dismissing him without hearing him out could cost us all." A murmur swept across the table, the kind of murmur that signaled doubt had entered the picture. Gregory forced a laugh, one that sounded thinner than before. Come on, Sylvia. Are we really entertaining this? He pushes a broom, for God's sake. What's next? Are we going to take medical advice from the guy who delivers the mail? Harold Kinney leaned forward, folding his hands. Don't twist this, Greg. I've dealt with enough arrogance in my career to know when it's covering fear. He's not stumbling over words. He's not buying time. He's speaking like the person who actually knows this design. The other executives whispered among themselves now, some leaning towards Samuel, others shooting uneasy glances at Gregory. The junior project manager who'd been shut down earlier kept his eyes fixed on the table, as though afraid that breathing too loudly might draw Gregory's fire. Connor Briggs broke the silence with a question that surprised everyone. Mr. Okoye, if you've been working here as long as I think you have, why didn't you speak up earlier? Samuel looked at him directly. Because people rarely listen when you wear gloves and carry a mop. I waited. I worked quietly, but I never stopped designing. And eventually, I realized staying silent would cost families more than it cost me. Connor swallowed hard and sat back. His expression told everyone that Samuel's words had landed, but Gregory wasn't done. His voice rose, cutting through the air. This is absurd. Do you all understand the liability here? If word gets out that this firm let an unlicensed janitor design a multi-million-dollar project, the lawsuits would bury us. He's lying. He has to be a younger investor from Dallas. Alex Pruitt raised his hand slightly, his drawl soft but sharp. Or maybe you've been passing off someone else's work as your own. Maybe that's what we should be asking, Greg. The accusation struck like a dart. Gregory's face flushed deep red. He slammed his palm against the table. Watch yourself, Pruitt. But the damage was done. The suspicion in the room had shifted. Samuel didn't rush to fill the silence. He let them sit with their doubts, let them wrestle with the idea that the man who polished their shoes against the carpet at night might also be the mind behind the drawings stacked in front of them. Finally, Sylvia leaned in, her eyes fixed on Samuel. Tell me something only the creator of this blueprint would know. Something no one else could guess, Samuel nodded. He pointed to the corner of a design page. A small, nearly invisible symbol was drawn into the margins. That mark right there. It's a personal notation I've used in every sketch since college. My professor once told me to make my work identifiable, even in drafts. If you pull my old notebooks from my locker downstairs, you'll see the same mark on hundreds of pages. Connor's head whipped toward Gregory. Do you deny that mark is there? Gregory's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't answer. The silence stretched. The sound of a chair creaking under someone's weight was the only thing breaking it. Harold chuckled bitterly. Well, Greg, looks like the janitor has more proof of authorship than you've shown us all morning. For the first time in the meeting, Gregory looked cornered. His chest rose and fell faster, his posture stiffening as though trying to reclaim the authority slipping from his grasp. But his silence spoke louder than any of his bluster. Samuel took a small step back, his voice calm but steady. I didn't come here to embarrass anyone. I came here to make sure this project serves the people it was meant for. Families, children, seniors, not just investors looking for a tax shelter. The words landed like a stone in water, rippling through every person in the room. Even those skeptical of Samuel couldn't deny the sincerity in his voice. But sincerity alone wouldn't be enough. The next questions would demand proof of vision, and Samuel would have to reveal the true depth of his blueprint. Samuel's hand rested on the blueprint, the paper edges curling slightly under the weight of his palm. He didn't raise his voice, but there was a firmness in his tone that silenced the last of the whispers. Look closely, he said, pointing to the midsection of the design. Most projects like this separate affordable housing from luxury units. That's where mistakes begin. You create invisible walls. The community fractures before it even breathes. I refuse to do that. My design blends them together, floor by floor. It isn't charity. It's stability. Sylvia Torres leaned closer, adjusting her glasses again. Go on, she urged. Samuel traced another line, moving slowly so everyone could follow. This corridor connects shared recreational spaces. Playgrounds for children, green courtyards with benches, shared laundry facilities. By forcing interaction, you prevent division. That's how a neighborhood thrives. If you segregate wealth, you manufacture resentment. But when people's kids swing on the same swings, talk happens. Friendships happen. The room was quiet, except for the faint scratch of pens as two investors scribbled notes. Gregory rolled his eyes, scoffing. What is this? An architecture lecture or a fairy tale? Investors don't care about kids swinging on swings. They care about numbers. Samuel met his gaze, calm but unyielding. Then let's talk numbers. He flipped to another page. His finger stopped on a rooftop design with solar panels. The upfront cost is higher, but within 7 years, tenants save nearly 40% on utility bills. That means higher retention rates, fewer vacancies, and more stable revenue. Long-term profit comes not from squeezing tenants dry, but from creating an environment where they can actually afford to stay. Gregory's smirk faltered. For the first time, he had no immediate retort. Samuel pressed further. Flood prevention measures. Look here. Most developers ignore stormwater, treat it as an afterthought. But ask anyone in Raleigh after last year's floods if it's an afterthought. These retention basins protect both property and lives, and they reduce insurance premiums for decades. Harold Kinney chuckled, shaking his head slowly. He's not just an architect. He's a strategist. The younger investors leaned closer, whispering between themselves. The skepticism that had filled the room minutes earlier was shifting into interest, maybe even admiration. Gregory slammed his fist lightly against the table. Enough of this circus. He's playing you. He's feeding you what you want to hear. You think this man can carry the weight of a project worth hundreds of millions? He's a janitor. Samuel looked at him, unshaken. Yes, I clean these floors. I scrub your mess. I empty your trash. But I also design better buildings than the ones your firm has produced in years. Do you know why? Because I've had to live with the consequences of poor design. I've seen families displaced. I've seen children forced to move schools again and again. I've seen grandparents drowning in rent because someone decided green space was a waste of money. That's why my designs account for people, not just profit. His words hung in the air, heavy, undeniable. Connor Briggs, his voice quiet but firm, asked, Mr. Okoye, if everything you're saying is true, why stay? Why not leave, find another firm, prove yourself somewhere else? Samuel took a breath. His eyes softened. Because this city is my home. My parents raised me here after leaving everything behind. I wanted to leave a mark, not in glass towers or gated communities, but in neighborhoods where kids like me could believe they mattered. If I left, these ideas would gather dust in notebooks. But here they might actually stand. The investors exchanged looks again, but this time their faces showed something new. Respect. Sylvia closed the folder in front of her. Gregory, whether you like it or not, this man is giving us reasons to invest, and not just emotional ones, practical, financial, sustainable reasons. Gregory's hand gripped the armrest of his chair until his knuckles whitened. His voice lowered into a growl. Don't forget who owns this company. Who signs the checks? This man isn't part of this meeting. He has no seat at this table. Samuel's reply was steady, unwavering. Then maybe your table is too small. The silence that followed was deafening. Every investor, every junior staffer, every assistant in the room felt the impact of those words. But the real test was coming. The investors would no longer settle for talk. They wanted Samuel to face questions that could either elevate him as the true visionary or crush him under the weight of their scrutiny. The mood inside the conference room had shifted completely. The same executives who moments earlier had sat stone-faced now leaned in with genuine curiosity. Their pens were moving, their eyes darting from Samuel to the blueprints and back again. Even the silence seemed different, not awkward, but expectant. It was Sylvia who broke it. Mr. Okoye, she said carefully, you've given us ideas, numbers, and context. But here's what matters most to us. Can your design survive the real test? Questions, pressure, scrutiny. Because millions of dollars, and more importantly, thousands of lives, will depend on it. Samuel nodded. Ask me anything. Harold Kinney, who had been quiet for a few minutes, leaned forward, elbows pressing against the table. His voice carried the authority of decades in real estate. All right. Your project calls for green courtyards and playgrounds. Sounds lovely. But what about maintenance? What happens when weeds grow, equipment rusts, and costs balloon? Investors won't like paying for upkeep that doesn't directly raise revenue. Samuel's answer came quickly. The cost of neglect is higher than the cost of care. I've built recurring maintenance into the tenant association fees, small, predictable, and manageable. Families contribute, but they also gain. Children have safe spaces, seniors have gardens, and turnover drops significantly. Stability saves us more money than neglect ever will. Murmurs of approval circled the room. Then Connor Briggs, emboldened by the shift, asked, "What about crime prevention? It's no secret that mixed-income housing attracts scrutiny. How do you address safety without creating the feeling of surveillance or policing?" Samuel gestured to the designs again. Lighting placement, window orientation, open sightlines. Crime thrives where people feel hidden, where shadows protect bad choices. These designs eliminate blind spots, and when neighbors know each other, because their kids play together, because they share the same laundry room, community polices itself. Safety isn't bought with more cameras. It's built through trust. Even Sylvia raised her eyebrows at that answer. Gregory, however, leaned back, trying to mask his growing unease. His voice dripped with disdain. "You sound rehearsed, Mr. Okoye. Like you've been waiting your whole life for this stage. Maybe you've read enough books to play the part, but design is more than ideas. It's execution. What happens when budgets tighten, contractors cut corners, or politicians start meddling? What then?" For the first time, Samuel allowed himself a small smile. "Then you fight for the integrity of the project. You fight for the families depending on it. If you compromise at every corner, you build nothing worth keeping. That's the problem with too many developments in this city. They were designed to look good in brochures, not to stand for 50 years. I'm not here to create a brochure. I'm here to create homes." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Alex Pruitt, the younger investor, leaned forward. "Mr. Harlow, with respect, I've sat through a lot of your presentations. You talk numbers well, but I've never once heard you talk about families or longevity. This man, janitor or not, is making me want to write a check." Gregory's face twisted with frustration. "You'd stake millions on a man with no license? No portfolio? A man who pushes a broom?" Sylvia shot back sharply. "What I see is someone who knows the soil, the streets, the realities of the community. When was the last time you walked through those neighborhoods, Greg?" Gregory didn't answer. His silence said more than any excuse could. Samuel, sensing the tide fully turning, leaned slightly closer to the table. His voice softened, but every word carried weight. "I never asked for this moment. I never demanded recognition. All I ever wanted was for my ideas to breathe, to prove that buildings could serve people instead of crushing them. If you reject me because I wear the wrong uniform, then so be it. But if you listen to the design itself, you'll see that it doesn't care about uniforms. It just works." The investors were quiet again, but not with doubt, with thought. Pens clicked closed, binders shut. Their faces showed the calculation of people weighing risk against vision, profit against legacy. And in that balance, Gregory could feel his authority slipping through his fingers. But the final decision wasn't his to make. The investors were ready to turn the spotlight fully onto Samuel, forcing Gregory into a silence he could no longer control. The silence that followed was heavier than anything the room had felt all morning. Gregory sat rigid in his leather chair, his jaw tight, his fingers drumming against the polished oak. He looked less like the man in control and more like someone desperately trying to hold on to it. Across from him, Samuel stood calm and steady, his work shirt damp with sweat from nerves, but his voice unwavering. Finally, Sylvia Torres broke the silence. "Mr. Okoye," she said, carefully enunciating his name, "you've convinced me. Not because of sentiment, but because of substance. Every answer you've given has been grounded in logic, experience, and foresight. That's more than I can say for what we've heard from the top of this company today." Her words landed with the weight of a verdict. Several investors nodded. Alex Pruitt leaned back in his chair and let out a low whistle. "She's right. I came here expecting the usual song and dance. Instead, the only person giving me confidence in this project isn't even on payroll as a designer." Gregory shot to his feet. His voice was sharp, almost desperate. "This is my company. You don't get to come in here and hijack my project. Do you understand the precedent this sets? A janitor waltzing in and taking credit? If this story gets out, it'll destroy us. Harold Kinney, who had been studying Gregory quietly, finally spoke with the authority of age and experience. Gregory, what will destroy you is pretending not to see what's standing right in front of us. You've built a business on arrogance, but investors like us know the difference between arrogance and vision. This man has vision. The room murmured in agreement. Gregory's face darkened. He turned toward Samuel, trying one last time to cut him down. Even if every word you've said is true, you don't belong here. You're not licensed. You're not certified. You're not one of us. Samuel didn't flinch. He placed both hands on the table, leaning forward slightly so his eyes locked on Gregory's. His voice dropped, calm but piercing. I belong wherever truth belongs. You asked for the real architect and I answered. You can deny me recognition. You can deny me pay. You can deny me a seat at this table. But you cannot deny that these designs are mine. They speak for themselves. And in time, so will history. The power in his words struck the room like a hammer. Sylvia looked around the table. We're not here to debate uniforms. We're here to invest in ideas that last. And I think it's clear whose ideas those are. Connor Briggs, the nervous junior executive, finally raised his head and spoke. Mr. Okoye, if you're willing, I'd like to work with you directly. I don't care about titles. I care about learning from someone who actually sees the people behind the buildings. For the first time, Samuel allowed himself a small smile. I'd be honored. Gregory's chair screeched as he shoved it backward. His face was pale with rage. This is mutiny, he hissed. But his words carried no weight anymore. His authority had already been stripped, not by force, but by truth. The investors turned away from him. Their attention was now fully on Samuel. Sylvia closed her binder and stood. Then it's settled. We move forward with these designs. And Mr. Okoye, janitor or not, you've just secured the respect of everyone in this room. Applause wasn't loud, but it was steady, genuine. Even the staff, who had been too afraid to speak earlier, looked at Samuel differently now. Samuel didn't bask in it. He didn't gloat. He simply nodded once, his voice soft but resolute. Respect isn't earned by where you sit. It's earned by what you give. I only ever wanted to give my city a chance to breathe again. The applause grew stronger. Gregory slumped into his chair, defeated, his silence the final acknowledgement of a battle lost. The meeting ended, but the story didn't. For weeks afterward, people in the office whispered not about Gregory's tantrum, but about Samuel's courage. They spoke about the man who had carried trash cans in one hand and blueprints in the other. The man who had been invisible until he forced the world to see him. And through it all, Samuel kept showing up, still sweeping floors, still emptying bins. But now, every time he walked into a room, people lifted their heads and saw not just the janitor, but the architect of change. Because in the end, the lesson wasn't about buildings or contracts. It was about respect. Never underestimate the person you overlook. Never dismiss the quiet worker in the corner. Because the moment you do, you might just miss the genius who could change everything. So if you've ever been overlooked, ignored, or underestimated, remember this story. Respect isn't tied to a title, a paycheck, or a corner office. It's tied to truth, to effort, to the courage of standing up when it matters. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, make sure to subscribe, because the next one might just change how you see the world around you.